Have you ever wondered if the person sitting alone in the corner of a quiet diner might be the one who changes your life forever? The rain had been falling over Nashville for 3 days straight, turning the city into a gray watercolor of blurred lights and rushing umbrellas. Inside May's kitchen, a small diner tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat on the east side of town, the windows had fogged over from the warmth inside, creating a cocoon against the November cold. Savannah Cole wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, more out of habit than necessity, watching the door with tired eyes that still held a flicker of something stubborn, something that refused to go out no matter how hard life tried to extinguish it. She was 34 years old. With honey-brown skin and natural curls, she kept pulled back in a practical ponytail while working. Her hands were strong from years of carrying heavy plates, and there were fine lines around her eyes, from smiling at customers, even when she didn't feel like smiling. Savannah had worked at May's Kitchen for almost 7 years now, long enough to know every regular by name, to remember who took their coffee black and who needed extra cream, to recognize the difference between someone having a bad day and someone having a bad life. Tonight, the diner was nearly empty. Old Mr. Patterson sat in his usual booth by the window, nursing a slice of pecan pie and reading yesterday's newspaper. A young couple shared a milkshake near the jukebox, their heads bent together in that intimate way of new love. And then there was the man who had just walked in, dripping rainwater onto the worn linoleum floor. Savannah noticed him immediately, not because he was remarkable, but because he looked like he belonged somewhere else entirely. Somewhere without cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been sitting too long. He wore a heavy canvas jacket that had seen better days, work boots caked with mud, and a wool cap pulled low over graying hair. His face was weathered, unshaven, and his clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else. But his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held an alertness that didn't match the rest of him. Those eyes were sharp, observant, cataloging everything they saw with an intelligence that seemed out of place in such a tired package. He chose the booth farthest from the door, sliding in with the careful movements of someone whose joints ached. Savannah grabbed a menu and a glass of water, making her way over with the same easy warmth she offered everyone who walked through those doors. "Evening," she said, setting the water down on the table. "Nasty night out there. You look like you could use something warm." The man looked up at her, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than she expected. "Just coffee, please, and maybe some bread if you have any." "We've got cornbread fresh out of the oven," Savannah offered. "Goes real nice with our chicken soup. Weather like this, soup's the best medicine there is." He shook his head slowly. "Just the coffee and bread. That's all I can manage tonight." Savannah understood. She'd seen that look before, the calculation behind the eyes, the mental math of counting what was in your pocket against what was in your stomach. She nodded without any change in her expression, without any pity that might wound his dignity. "Coming right up." In the kitchen, she ladled out a bowl of chicken soup anyway, thick with vegetables and tender meat, steam rising like a promise. She cut 2 thick slices of cornbread and added an extra pat of butter. Then she poured the darkest, richest coffee they had, the good stuff she saved for customers who looked like they needed it. When she returned to his booth, she set everything down in front of him. The soup, the bread, the coffee, and a small dish of honey for the cornbread. He stared at the food, then back at her. "I only ordered coffee and bread." "I know," Savannah said simply. "But I made too much soup tonight, and it's just going to go to waste. Manager gets on my case about throwing food away. You'd be doing me a favor, honestly." It was a lie, and they both knew it. May's Kitchen never wasted food, and Savannah would be paying for that soup out of her own tips. But the lie was kind, offered in a way that let him accept without losing his pride. The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might refuse. But then his shoulders dropped slightly, and he wrapped his hands around the warm bowl. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice was softer. "That's very kind." Savannah just smiled and left him to eat in peace. She went back to the counter, refilling Mr. Patterson's coffee, checking on the young couple who were too lost in each other to need anything. The dinner rush, such as it was, had long passed, and the night stretched ahead with the particular slowness of rainy evenings. Savannah found herself glancing back at the man in the corner booth, watching as he ate slowly, carefully, savoring each bite like he hadn't had a proper meal in days. The truth was, Savannah understood hunger. Not the dramatic storybook kind, but the quiet, grinding kind that came from choosing between groceries and electricity, from making one meal stretch into 3, from knowing that the math just didn't add up no matter how many shifts you worked. She'd grown up with that hunger, raised by a grandmother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't quite make ends meet. And though things were a little better now, though she had her own small apartment and a steady job and had managed to save a little money in a jar hidden in her closet, she never forgot what it felt like to be that close to the edge. So when she saw someone else standing on that edge, she reached out. It was just who she was. An hour passed. The young couple left, holding hands as they ran through the rain to their car. Mr. Patterson finally finished his pie and shuffled out with a wave and a promise to see her tomorrow. The diner grew quiet, just the hum of the refrigerators and the soft patter of rain against glass. Savannah started her closing routine, wiping down tables, restocking napkin dispensers, counting out the register. The man in the corner booth had finished his soup and bread long ago, but he remained seated, hands wrapped around his 3rd cup of coffee, staring out the fogged window at nothing in particular. She approached his table with the coffee pot. "Refill?" He looked up at her, and again she caught that strange alertness in his eyes, that sense that there was more to him than the shabby clothes and unshaven face suggested. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. Savannah poured his coffee. "Almost 7 years. And before that?" "I was in school for a while. Then life got complicated." She said it lightly without bitterness. "But I like it here. May, the owner, she's good people, treats her staff like family. That's worth more than a fancy title, you know." The man nodded slowly. "It is. Most people don't understand that. Most people haven't had to learn it the hard way." Savannah smiled. "You need anything else? We close in about 30 minutes, but you're welcome to stay out of the rain as long as you like." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bill, smoothing it on the table. It was a 5. "This is all I have," he said quietly. "For the coffee. And the bread. The soup, too, even though you said it was going to waste." Savannah looked at the bill, then at him. She thought about her rent, due in a week. She thought about the jar in her closet with barely $200 in it. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that kindness was never wasted, even when you couldn't afford it. Then she reached out and gently pushed the bill back across the table toward him. "Keep it," she said. "You need it more than I do right now. And around here, guests don't pay for kindness." The man's eyes widened. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then, very slowly, he picked up the bill and put it back in his pocket. "What's your name?" he asked. "Savannah. Savannah Cole." "Savannah," he repeated, as if memorizing it. "That's a beautiful name. My grandmother picked it, said it sounded like somewhere warm and green, full of trees and possibility." She laughed softly. "I've never actually been to Georgia, but I like the thought." The man smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him all night. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less tired, almost handsome beneath the gray stubble and weathered skin. "Thank you, Savannah," he said. "You have no idea what you've given me tonight." "Just soup and some cornbread," she said. "Nothing special." But he shook his head, still smiling that strange, knowing smile. "No, you gave me something I've been looking for a very long time." Before she could ask what he meant, he stood up, pulling his cap lower and turning toward the door. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the streetlights cast wavering reflections on the wet pavement. "Will I see you again?" Savannah asked, surprising herself with the question. He paused at the door, looking back at her over his shoulder. "I think you might," he said. "Good night, Savannah." And then he was gone, swallowed by the November night. Savannah stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, feeling like something important had just happened, even though she couldn't say what. Then she shook her head, laughed at her own foolishness, and went back to closing up the diner. She didn't know that the man walking away from May's kitchen was worth $3 billion. She didn't know that his name was Daniel Warren, that he owned hotels across 4 continents, that his face had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune and half a dozen other magazines. She didn't know that he had spent the last month disguising himself as a homeless man, walking the streets of cities across America, searching for something that had nothing to do with money. And she certainly didn't know that in approximately 6 weeks, her entire life would be turned upside down because of a bowl of chicken soup and a single sentence: "Guests don't pay for kindness." When Savannah finally finished closing up the diner, she stepped out into the cool night air and stood there for a moment, looking up and down the empty street. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and glittering under the streetlights. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, a dog barked, the ordinary sounds of a city settling into sleep. But Savannah didn't feel ordinary. She felt unsettled in a way she couldn't quite explain. She walked the 3 blocks to her apartment building, a tired brick structure with a fire escape that groaned in the wind, and a super who was always 2 weeks behind on repairs. Her unit was on the 3rd floor, a small 1-bedroom with windows that faced an alley. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the second-hand sofa that her grandmother had once called perfectly serviceable. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old pipes. On the coffee table sat a stack of bills, a half-finished crossword puzzle, and a worn paperback novel she had been meaning to finish for weeks. This was her life. Work, home, sleep, repeat. The occasional dinner with her cousin Denise. A phone call with an old college friend every few months. Nothing exciting. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would ever make anyone take notice. And yet tonight, she couldn't stop thinking about the man in the corner booth. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. He was older than her, shabby, clearly going through something difficult. But there had been something in the way he looked at her. Like she was the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. Like she mattered in a way that went beyond coffee refills and soup orders. Savannah shook her head at her own foolishness. She was reading too much into a random encounter. Tomorrow she would wake up, go back to work, and never see him again. That was how life worked for people like her. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself hoping she was wrong. Daniel Warren didn't sleep that night. He sat in the penthouse suite of the Opryland Hotel, still wearing his threadbare clothes, staring out at the Nashville skyline and thinking about a woman named Savannah who had given him hope for the first time in years. The disguise had been his idea. After his wife of 15 years had divorced him, taking half his fortune and leaving him with the bitter realization that she had never loved him, only his money, Daniel had fallen into a depression that no amount of success could cure. He had everything the world said should make a man happy. Wealth, power, influence, the ability to buy anything he wanted, but he had no one to share it with. No one who saw him as anything other than a number on a bank statement. His children, if you could call them that, were worse. His son, Tyler, was 32 years old and had never worked a day in his life. He spent his days gambling, partying, and cycling through girlfriends who were attracted to his last name and nothing else. His daughter, Madison, was slightly better. She at least held a job at one of his hotels. But she treated the staff with casual cruelty and viewed the business as her birthright rather than a responsibility. Daniel had made them that way, he knew. He had been absent for most of their childhoods, working 80-hour weeks, building his empire while nannies and boarding schools raised his children. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. Tyler and Madison were who they were, and no amount of money could buy them character. So Daniel had decided to test the world. Not to find an heir, he had lawyers and succession plans for that, but to find something more personal. Hope. Proof that decency still existed somewhere, that not everyone saw him as a walking wallet. For a month, he had wandered. He had been turned away from restaurants, ignored by pedestrians, treated like garbage by people who would have fawned over him if they knew his true identity. He had seen the worst of humanity, the casual cruelty of those who had never known want, the indifference of those too comfortable to notice suffering. And then he had walked into May's kitchen. He had expected the same treatment, a tired waitress going through the motions, offering minimum service for minimum tip, eager to be rid of the dirty homeless man taking up space in her section. Instead, he had found Savannah Cole. She had seen him, really seen him, not as a charity case or a burden, but as a person deserving of dignity. She had given him food she couldn't afford to give, and when he had tried to pay, she had refused. Guests don't pay for kindness. Daniel turned those words over in his mind, examining them like a jewel. In his world, everyone paid. Everything was transactional. Kindness was a currency, exchanged for favors, for influence, for power. No one gave anything for free. But Savannah had. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. His assistant, Margaret, answered on the first ring, even though it was nearly midnight. "Mr. Warren? Is everything all right? I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Savannah Cole," Daniel said. "She works at a diner called May's Kitchen on the east side of Nashville. I want to know where she lives, where she grew up, her education, her family, everything. But Margaret, this stays between us. No one else can know. Not Tyler, not Madison, not the board. Just you and me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret had worked for Daniel for 20 years. She knew when not to ask questions. "I'll have a report for you by morning, sir." "Thank you, Margaret. And one more thing. Find out if May's Kitchen has any financial troubles. Liens, back taxes, anything like that. If they do, I want them paid off. Anonymously. The owner shouldn't know where the money came from." "Yes, sir." Daniel hung up and turned back to the window. The Nashville skyline glittered before him. All those lights representing all those lives, most of them struggling, most of them hoping for something better. He thought about Savannah's tired eyes and stubborn smile. He thought about the way she had spoken about her grandmother, with love rather than regret. He thought about the warmth in her voice when she offered him soup, the dignity in her refusal of his money. Daniel Warren had built an empire on his ability to read people, to understand what they wanted and how to give it to them. And he had never met anyone quite like Savannah Cole. He wanted to see her again. Not as a homeless stranger, but as himself. He wanted to know if her kindness was real, or if it would vanish when she learned who he truly was. But he was afraid that the moment she knew his name, she would become like everyone else, seeing only dollars where there should have been a man. So Daniel made a decision. He would return to May's Kitchen, but not as Daniel Warren. Not yet. He would go back as the man she had shown kindness to, and he would learn who Savannah Cole really was. It was dangerous. It was perhaps the most reckless thing he had done in his carefully controlled life. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something that wasn't loneliness or disappointment. He felt curious, He felt hopeful. He felt alive. Savannah didn't think about the strange man for the next few days. She had too much else to worry about. Her rent was due, her car was making a troubling noise, and her cousin Denise needed help watching her kids while she worked the night shift at the hospital. Life didn't leave much room for dwelling on mysterious strangers, no matter how intriguing their eyes might have been. But on Thursday night, when the rain had finally cleared and a cold snap had settled over Nashville, he walked back into May's kitchen. Savannah was carrying a tray of coffee cups to a table of regulars when the door opened and she saw him. He was wearing the same clothes, or similar ones, still looking like a man who had fallen on hard times. But he had shaved, and his hair was neater under the wool cap, and when he looked at her, he smiled like they were old friends. "You came back," she said, setting down her tray and walking over to greet him. "You said I might," he replied. "Is my booth available?" She laughed. "Your booth? I didn't know you'd claimed it." "I'm claiming it now." His smile widened. "If that's all right with the management, I'll allow it." She led him to the same corner booth, the one farthest from the door. "Coffee?" "Please, and whatever soup you made too much of today." She smiled at the callback. "We've got vegetable beef. It's thick enough to stand a spoon in." "Sounds perfect." She brought him his food and coffee, and this time when she set them down, she lingered a moment. "I don't know your name," she said. "You never told me." He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then he said, "David. My name is David." It wasn't a complete lie. David was his middle name, but Daniel couldn't risk giving her his real first name, not with his face having been on so many magazine covers. Even with the shabby clothes and weathered appearance, someone might make the connection. "David," Savannah repeated. "That's a good name. Biblical. My mother was religious." That part was true. His mother had been a devout Baptist who had raised him on Sunday sermons and Wednesday night prayer meetings before she passed away when he was 16. She said David was a man after God's own heart, whatever his flaws. Sounds like my grandmother. She used to say the same thing about the saints. They weren't perfect, they were just persistent. Savannah tucked her order pad into her apron. "You eat up. I'll check on you in a bit." She went back to work, but throughout the evening, she found herself returning to his booth more often than strictly necessary. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her back against her better judgment. Every time their eyes met across the diner, she felt a little flutter in her chest that she tried very hard to ignore. Between serving other customers, she would pause by his table. At first, the conversations were brief and polite. Weather observations, comments about the music playing on the old jukebox, small talk that filled silence without demanding anything. But as the hours passed, the conversations deepened. She learned that he was from somewhere up north, that he had worked in business before things went wrong, that he was in Nashville looking for a fresh start. He learned that she had grown up in Memphis, that she had come to Nashville for college and never left, that her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, and she still missed her every day. "What brought you to college here?" David asked during one of her stops at his booth. Savannah refilled his coffee, thinking about how to answer. "Music, originally. I had this crazy dream about becoming a songwriter. Nashville seemed like the only place to try. And I found out pretty quick that having dreams and having talent are two different things." She smiled, but there was old pain underneath it. "I could write lyrics, but I couldn't play an instrument to save my life. And without that, the music industry here doesn't have much use for you. So you gave up?" "I grew up." She said it without bitterness, just acceptance. "My grandmother got sick. I needed steady income, not maybe someday royalties. May offered me a job, and I took it. End of story." "That doesn't have to be the end," David said quietly. "Dreams don't expire." Savannah looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her chest. You sound like you believe that. I do. I've seen people reinvent themselves at 60, at 70. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Easy to say. Harder to do, he agreed. But not impossible. She wanted to believe him. For a moment, standing in the warm glow of the diner lights, she almost did. By the time May's kitchen closed, they had talked for hours. Savannah couldn't remember the last time she had enjoyed a conversation so much. David was intelligent, thoughtful, curious about her life in a way that felt genuine rather than invasive. He asked about her dreams, her disappointments, her hopes for the future. And when she answered, he listened with complete attention, as if nothing in the world mattered more than what she had to say. "You should let me pay for my dinner tonight," he said, as she cleared his dishes. Savannah hesitated. She remembered what she had said last time, about guests not paying for kindness. But she also knew that he probably needed every dollar he had. "Tell you what," she said, "you can pay for your dinner if you promise to come back tomorrow." He looked up at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You want me to come back?" "I haven't had a conversation that good in months. Maybe years." She felt her cheeks warm and looked away, suddenly embarrassed by her own honesty. "I mean, you don't have to. I just meant—" "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." He paid for his dinner, leaving exactly the amount on the bill plus a small tip. When he stood to leave, he paused by the door and looked back at her one more time. "Thank you, Savannah, for the soup and the conversation. See you tomorrow, David." He smiled, and something in his expression made her heart skip in a way she hadn't felt in years. Then he walked out into the cold Nashville night, leaving her with empty tables to wipe down and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having something to look forward to. David came back the next night, and the night after that. Within a week, it had become a routine. He would arrive around 7, take his booth in the corner, and order whatever soup Savannah recommended. She would bring him his food, and between her other tables, they would talk. They talked about everything: music and books and movies, politics and philosophy and religion. They debated whether Nashville hot chicken was overrated. Spoiler alert, Savannah said yes. David said he needed more research. They discussed the meaning of success and whether money could buy happiness. They argued about whether dogs or cats made better pets. David said dogs because of their loyalty. Savannah said cats because they made you earn their affection. One evening, during a lull between the dinner rush and the late-night stragglers, David asked about her favorite books. Savannah found herself talking animatedly about the novels that had shaped her, the characters who felt like friends, the stories that had made her cry and laugh and think. "The Count of Monte Cristo," she said, counting on her fingers. "Pride and Prejudice, The Color Purple, To Kill a Mockingbird, and anything by Toni Morrison." "That's quite a range," David observed. "Revenge, romance, social justice. Stories about people who overcome, who fight for what they believe in, even when the world tells them they can't win." She shrugged, a little self-conscious. "I guess I've always been drawn to that." "Because you see yourself in them?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know. Maybe. My grandmother used to say I was stubborn as a mule and twice as hard-headed." I think she meant it as a compliment. Savannah laughed. "She definitely did not. I was a nightmare teenager, thought I knew everything, didn't listen to anyone. It wasn't until she got sick that I finally grew up enough to appreciate what she'd sacrificed for me." David was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee slowly. "Do you think we only appreciate people after it's too late?" "Sometimes. Not always." She met his eyes. "I think it depends on whether we're paying attention." "And are you? Paying attention?" "I'm trying to be." She felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked away. What about you? What books made you who you are? David considered the question. The Great Gatsby. I read it in high school and hated it. Then I read it again at 40 and realized I had become Tom Buchanan without noticing. Savannah's eyebrows rose. That's surprisingly honest. I had money, I had status, I had everything the world tells you should make you happy. And I was careless with all of it, including the people in my life. He set down his coffee cup. It was a wake-up call. Not that I acted on it quickly enough. But you're acting on it now. Isn't that what matters? I'm trying to. Hence the fresh start. She wanted to ask more, about his past, about what had gone wrong, about who he had been before he showed up in her diner looking like he'd lost everything. But something in his expression told her he wasn't ready to share those details yet. So instead, she simply said, "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're off to a good start." The smile he gave her was worth more than any tip she'd ever received. Sometimes their conversations turned more personal. Savannah told him about her grandmother, about how the woman had worked herself to the bone to give Savannah a better life, about the guilt she still felt for not being there when her grandmother died. "I was at work," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd been in hospice for a week. I knew it was coming. But I had to work, needed the money, couldn't afford to take time off. And she died at 3:47 in the afternoon while I was serving burgers to tourists. David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The gesture was simple, human, profound in its ordinariness. She knew you loved her. That's what matters. Everyone says that. Because it's true. The people who love us don't keep score of the minutes we spend by their side. They feel our love in 1,000 small ways. The phone calls, the visits, the sacrifices we make. Your grandmother knew what you were doing and why, and I guarantee she was proud of you for doing it. Savannah felt tears prick her eyes. How can you be so sure? Because that's what parents do, the good ones anyway. They want us to succeed, even if it means missing the moments they'd prefer to share. His voice was thick with emotion. My mother died when I was 16. Heart attack. Completely unexpected. I was at basketball practice. I remember thinking afterward that I should have been there, that somehow I could have saved her if I'd just been present. But you couldn't have. No, I know that now. But it took years to accept. And even longer to understand that she would have wanted me at that practice, improving myself, building a future. She didn't raise me to hover by her bedside waiting for tragedy. She raised me to live. Savannah turned her hand over so their palms were touching. Thank you for telling me that. Thank you for listening. They sat that way for a long moment, hands linked across the worn Formica table. Two people who had lost mothers and found each other in the wake of that loss. The diner hummed quietly around them, but for those few minutes, they were the only two people in the world. David told her about his mother, too. About watching her faith sustain her through a difficult marriage. About the hole her death had left in his life. They talked about heartbreak. Savannah had ended an engagement 3 years ago when she discovered her fiancé had been cheating, and David spoke vaguely of a marriage that had ended badly, though he never gave details. Marcus, Savannah said flatly. My ex. He was a musician. Talented, charming, completely convinced that the world owed him something. I worked double shifts for 2 years so he could focus on his music career, and the whole time, he was sleeping with the backup singer. I'm sorry. Don't be. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. She laughed without humor. Not the cheating part, the leaving part. I was so wrapped up in taking care of him that I'd forgotten how to take care of myself. When I finally walked away, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. But it still hurts. The betrayal does. the trust I gave him that he threw away. But I don't miss him. I miss who I thought he was, which is a very different thing. David nodded slowly. I understand that completely. The person we love is sometimes an illusion we've created. And when the illusion shatters, we mourn it like a death, even though it was never real. Is that what happened with your marriage? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, My wife loved what I could give her. The lifestyle, the security, the status. When I looked in her eyes, I saw dollar signs reflected back at me. For years I told myself it was enough, that maybe love was just a fairy tale, and mutual benefit was all anyone could reasonably expect. He shook his head. I was wrong. How did it end? Badly, with lawyers and accusations and a settlement that would make you dizzy. He met her eyes. I don't regret the divorce. I regret the years I wasted pretending a transaction was a relationship. Savannah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition, a kinship with this man who understood what it was like to love the wrong person for the right reasons. Maybe that's why we keep coming back here, she said softly. Both of us, looking for something real. Maybe it is. Through it all, Savannah noticed things. Small things that didn't quite add up. The way David's vocabulary sometimes slipped into formal, almost corporate language. The way his hands, despite looking weathered, were too soft and well-manicured for someone who had supposedly worked manual labor. The way he sometimes caught himself before saying something, as if editing his words in real time. But she didn't press. Everyone had secrets. Everyone had parts of themselves they kept hidden. And whatever David's secrets were, they didn't change the man who sat across from her night after night, listening to her stories and sharing his own, making her laugh and think and feel less alone. 3 weeks after their first meeting, on a night when the diner was particularly empty, David asked her something unexpected. When you were young, he said, what did you dream of becoming? Savannah was wiping down the coffee machine, but she paused at the question. That's a big one. I know. I've been wanting to ask for a while. She came over to his booth and slid into the seat across from him. This had become their habit. When the diner was empty, she would sit with him for a few minutes before going back to work. When I was little, she said slowly, I wanted to be a writer. I used to make up stories all the time. Filled up notebooks with them. My grandmother called me her little Shakespeare. What happened? Savannah shrugged, but the casualness was forced. Life happened. My grandmother got sick when I was in college. I came home to take care of her, dropped out to work full-time. By the time she passed, I was too old and too tired to go back to chasing dreams. You're not too old, David said quietly. I'm 34. And? You think 34 is the cutoff for dreams? Savannah laughed, but it came out sadder than she intended. It's the cutoff for being practical. I've got bills to pay and no safety net. I can't afford to take risks on maybe someday. David was quiet for a moment, studying her with those two sharp eyes. Then he said, What would you write about? If you could write anything? Savannah thought about it. She hadn't let herself think about it in years. Stories about people like me. Like the people who come in here every day. People who work hard and love deeply and never make the headlines, but whose lives are just as important as anyone else's. People who find grace in small moments. Who build families out of strangers. Who keep going even when everything tells them to stop. That sounds beautiful, David said. It sounds nice, Savannah corrected. But nice doesn't pay rent. David leaned forward, his expression intent. What if it could? What if someone gave you the chance to write, really write, without worrying about rent or bills or anything else? Would you take it? Savannah felt her heart speed up, though she couldn't say why. That's a fairy tale, David. Things like that don't happen to people like me. Maybe they should. He reached across the table, and for the first time, he touched her hand. His fingers were warm against hers, gentle but certain. Maybe you deserve more than you let yourself believe, Savannah. She stared at him, at the intensity in his eyes, at the way he was looking at her like she was something precious, rather than ordinary. Her throat tightened with emotions she couldn't name. "Why are you really here, David?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. She could see the conflict in his face, the battle between truth and something else, fear, maybe, or caution. Then he squeezed her hand and said, "I'm someone who has been looking for a long time for proof that the world isn't as cold as it seems. And I found it in a diner on a rainy night, when a woman I'd never met gave me soup and refused my money. David, I know I have secrets, Savannah. I know you've noticed. And I promise you, I'm going to tell you everything. Soon. But not tonight. Tonight I just want to sit here with you and be grateful that you're the kind of person who sees strangers as guests." Savannah felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know why she was crying, only that something about this moment felt fragile and important and worth protecting. "Okay," she said softly. "Not tonight, but soon." "Soon," he agreed. They sat there for a while longer, hands linked across the table, talking about smaller things, lighter things, while the rain started up again outside and the neon sign of May's kitchen flickered against the wet glass. When David finally left that night, he paused at the door as he always did. "Savannah," he said, "if things were different, if I were different, would you give me a chance?" "A chance at what?" He smiled, but there was vulnerability in it, a rawness she had never seen before, at being something more than a stranger who takes up your corner booth. Savannah's heart hammered in her chest. "I already think of you as more than that, David. Even though you don't know who I really am, I know who you are when you're here. I know you're kind and curious and lonely and hoping for something better. I know you listen when I talk and remember what I say. I know you look at me like I matter." She smiled through the tears she was no longer trying to hide. "The rest is just details." David's eyes glistened. He started to say something, stopped, then simply nodded once. "Soon," he said again. "I promise." Then he walked out into the rain, leaving Savannah with a heart full of hope and fear in equal measure. A week later, everything changed. It started with a woman walking into May's kitchen just after the lunch rush. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and personal trainers. She looked around the diner with unconcealed distaste, her nose wrinkling at the worn booths and fluorescent lights. Savannah was the only waitress on duty. She approached with her usual smile. "Hi there. Table for one?" The woman looked at her like she was an insect. "I'm looking for someone. A man who's been coming here regularly. Middle-aged, probably dresses like he's homeless even though he's not." Savannah felt her stomach drop. "I'm not sure who you mean." "Don't play dumb with me." The woman's voice turned sharp. "I've had people watching this place. I know my father has been coming here every night for weeks, playing some ridiculous game. I need to speak with him." "Your father?" The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Madison Warren. My father is Daniel Warren. Not that you'd know the name. He owns about half the hotels in this country, plus a few other things. Worth somewhere around $3 billion at last count." She tilted her head, studying Savannah with cold amusement. "Though I imagine to you, that number is just a fantasy." The room seemed to tilt. Savannah gripped the edge of a nearby table, trying to steady herself. "David." His name was David, except it wasn't. "I can see from your face that he's been here," Madison continued. "Let me guess. He's been playing the poor, misunderstood wanderer." Eating your soup and telling you sad stories about his life? That's his new hobby, apparently. Dressing like a bum and testing people's kindness. Something about his divorce breaking his brain. She rolled her eyes. Honestly, it's humiliating for the whole family. Savannah couldn't speak. Her mind was racing, replaying every conversation, every meaningful look, every touch of hands across the table. All of it had been a lie, a test. She had been a test. Here's the thing, Madison said, leaning closer. My father is not well, mentally, I mean. He's going through some sort of crisis, making irrational decisions, talking about rewriting his will to leave his fortune to strangers who are kind to him. Can you imagine? Billions of dollars going to random waitresses and janitors because they smiled at him once. I didn't. Savannah's voice came out strangled. I didn't know who he was. I never asked for anything. Of course you didn't. That's the whole point of his little game, isn't it? Finding people who don't ask for anything, so he can convince himself that humanity is redeemable or some nonsense. Madison's expression hardened. But here's what you need to understand. My family's money belongs to my family, not to you. Not to anyone else my father has taken a liking to during his breakdown. So whatever you think is happening here, whatever relationship you think you have with him, it ends now. You're going to stop seeing him. You're going to stop talking to him. And you're going to forget you ever met Daniel Warren. The door to the diner opened, and Savannah looked up to see David, Daniel, standing in the entrance. His face went white when he saw Madison. Madison, he said, his voice cold in a way Savannah had never heard. What are you doing here? Cleaning up your mess, Father. Madison crossed her arms. Someone has to protect this family while you're busy playing dress-up with the help. Daniel walked past his daughter without acknowledging her further. He stopped in front of Savannah, his eyes searching her face with something like desperation. Savannah, he said. I can explain. Your name is Daniel, she said flatly. You're a billionaire. This was all some kind of... what? Experiment? Test? It started that way, he admitted. But Savannah, please let me... You lied to me. Her voice cracked. You sat in that booth night after night and let me think. I told you things. Real things. About my grandmother, my dreams, my failures. And the whole time you were what? Taking notes? Deciding if I passed your little test? It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Daniel? She could see him struggling to find the right words. The man who had seemed so wise and understanding suddenly looked lost, grasping for a language that could bridge the gulf between them. I was searching for something, he finally said. After my divorce, after realizing that everyone in my life only cared about my money, I fell apart. I didn't know who I was anymore without the wealth defining me. I didn't know if there was anyone left in the world who could see the man beneath the fortune. So, you put on a costume and played games with people's emotions? It wasn't a game. His voice broke slightly. It was survival. I needed to know that kindness still existed. That not everyone would treat me like garbage when I had nothing to offer them. I visited dozens of places before I found you, Savannah, and everyone else treated me exactly the way you'd expect them to treat a homeless old man. Madison laughed derisively. Father, this is pathetic. You're embarrassing yourself. Be quiet, Madison. Daniel's voice was ice. He never took his eyes off Savannah. Do you understand? In every restaurant, every hotel, every store I visited, I was invisible at best and vermin at worst. And then I walked into this diner, and you saw me. You gave me food I couldn't pay for. You refused my money because you believed guests don't pay for kindness. But you're not a guest, Daniel. You're a billionaire playing pretend. I was a human being having the worst year of my life, and you treated me with dignity when I had done nothing to deserve it. That's not nothing. That's everything. Savannah felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. I don't know what to believe anymore, David. Daniel, whoever you are. I'm the man who fell in love with you somewhere between the cornbread and the third cup of coffee, he said softly. I'm the man who hasn't felt this alive in 20 years. And I'm the man who would give up every penny he has if it meant you would look at me the way you looked at me before you knew my name. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had been said and everything that couldn't be. Love? Savannah's voice was barely a whisper. You love me? I know it sounds impossible. I know we've only known each other for a few weeks. But Savannah, when I'm with you, I'm not a billionaire or a divorcee or a failure as a father. I'm just David. I'm the man who gets to sit across from you and listen to your stories and watch you light up when you talk about things you're passionate about. And I never want to be anyone else. Madison made a sound of disgust. This is nauseating. Father, you need to stop this nonsense and come home. The board is concerned. The family is concerned. We need to discuss the transition of leadership before you do something we can't undo. Daniel finally turned to face his daughter. The transition of leadership? You mean the hostile takeover you and your brother have been planning for months? Madison's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into cold composure. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. You've been meeting with my competitors. You've been briefing lawyers on my mental state. You've been laying the groundwork for a competency challenge. He shook his head slowly. I built that company from nothing, Madison. I built it while your mother was spending my money and you and your brother were learning that the world owed you something just for being born. The company needs new leadership. Someone who isn't having a midlife crisis in a third-rate diner. The company needs someone who understands that people matter more than profit margins. Something you never learned, because I never taught you. Daniel's voice was heavy with regret. That's my fault. I was so busy building an empire that I forgot to build a family. And now I have an empire run by strangers and a family full of predators. Madison's jaw tightened. You're going to regret saying that. I already regret a lot of things. That's not one of them. She stormed toward the door, pausing only to point one perfectly manicured finger at Savannah. This isn't over. Whatever you think is happening here, I promise you it won't last. My father is having a breakdown, and when the courts agree with me, everything goes back to the way it should be. The door slammed behind her, hard enough to rattle the windows. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his shoulders slumped, looking older and more tired than Savannah had ever seen him. Then he turned back to her. I'm sorry, he said. I am so sorry for all of it. For the lies. For my daughter. For dragging you into my mess of a life. Savannah felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. I don't know what to believe anymore, David. Daniel. Whoever you are. I'm both, he said quietly. David is who I was when I had nothing. Daniel is who I am when the world is watching. But with you, Savannah, I wanted to be David. I wanted to be the man you saw, not the name on a building. But they're both you. You can't separate them. No, I can't. He took a step toward her, then stopped, respecting the distance she was keeping. I should have told you the truth. Every day I knew I should have told you. But every day I was terrified that the moment you knew, everything would change. You'd start seeing the money instead of me. You'd start calculating what I could give you instead of just being present with me. I don't care about your money, Daniel. I know that now. I knew it the night you refused my $5. But fear isn't rational, Savannah. Fear takes the worst things that have happened to us and convinces us they'll happen again. My ex-wife, my children, my business partners, they all loved my wealth first and me second, if at all. I couldn't bear the thought of that happening with you. So you lied instead. I delayed the truth. I know it amounts to the same thing. He ran a hand through his hair, looking defeated. I was a coward. I chose my comfort over your right to know who you were spending time with. And I'm sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry." Savannah closed her eyes, trying to sort through the chaos of emotions flooding through her. Anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath all of it, something she couldn't deny. Something that felt terrifyingly like hope. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think. This is too much, Daniel. You have to understand that." "I understand." He took a step back, giving her space. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the Opryland Hotel, penthouse suite. If you want to talk, if you ever want to talk, I'll be there." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Not the crumpled bills of a homeless man, but a thick, cream-colored card with embossed lettering. Daniel Warren, Warren Hotels International. Savannah took it with trembling fingers. "For what it's worth," Daniel said. "Everything I told you about my mother, about my life, about who I am when no one is watching, that was all true. The only thing I lied about was the money. And I would take it all back if I could." "Can you? Take it back? The money? I've thought about it. Giving it all away, starting over with nothing." He smiled sadly. "But it wouldn't change who I am, Savannah. It wouldn't erase the past or fix my children or make my divorce unhappen. And it wouldn't make me more worthy of you. I never asked for worthy. I know. That's what makes you different from everyone else." Then he walked out the door, and Savannah was left alone in the empty diner, holding a billionaire's business card and wondering how her life had become something out of a fairy tale. A week passed, then 2. Savannah went through the motions of her life, working her shifts at May's kitchen, helping Denise with the kids, staring at the ceiling of her apartment at 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come. She didn't call Daniel. She didn't go to the Opryland Hotel, but she didn't throw away his card either. It sat on her nightstand, a small rectangle of possibility that she couldn't bring herself to touch or discard. The news broke on a Tuesday. Savannah was scrolling through her phone during a slow afternoon when she saw the headline, "Warren Hotel Air Claims, Father is Mentally Unfit, Seeks Control of Billion-Dollar Empire." Her heart stopped. The article detailed Madison and Tyler Warren's lawsuit against their father. They claimed he was suffering from emotional disturbance following his divorce, that he had been making erratic decisions, and that he was no longer competent to manage his own affairs. They were seeking emergency guardianship and control of Warren Hotels International. Buried in the article was a detail that made Savannah's blood run cold. The Warrens' lawyers claimed that Daniel had become obsessed with a Nashville waitress and was planning to make dangerous changes to his estate. They painted Savannah as a gold digger who had manipulated a vulnerable old man. She read the article 3 times, each reading making her angrier than the last. She wasn't a gold digger. She had never asked Daniel for anything. She had given him soup when he looked hungry, and refused his money when he tried to pay. And now his children were using her to take away his freedom? For the first time since learning the truth, Savannah stopped thinking about herself and started thinking about him. She thought about the man who had sat in her booth night after night, not because he wanted something from her, but because he was lonely. She thought about the way his eyes had lit up when she talked about her dreams. She thought about his quiet confession of love and the pain in his voice when he apologized. Daniel had lied to her, but his children were trying to destroy him. She grabbed her coat and her keys. 20 minutes later, she was standing in the lobby of the Opryland Hotel, looking around at the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and feeling completely out of place. The receptionist eyed her worn jeans and diner-issued polo with barely concealed disdain. "I'm here to see Daniel Warren," Savannah said. "Penthouse suite." The receptionist's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Warren isn't taking visitors. Tell him Savannah Cole is here. He'll see me." There was a phone call, a murmured conversation, and then the receptionist's entire demeanor changed. Suddenly there were smiles and offers of coffee and a personal escort to the private elevator. The penthouse was overwhelming. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, furniture that probably cost more than Savannah's annual salary, art on the walls that belonged in museums. But Savannah barely noticed any of it, because Daniel was there, rising from a chair, looking at her like she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't dared to speak. He looked different than the last time she had seen him. Smaller somehow, despite the grandeur surrounding him. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. For all his billions, he looked like a man who had spent 2 weeks in hell. "Savannah." His voice was rough. "You came." "I saw the news." She walked toward him, not stopping until she was close enough to touch. "Your children are trying to take everything from you." "They're trying, yes. Because of me? Because of who they are." He shook his head. "They've wanted control of the company for years. This lawsuit has been coming for a long time. You're just the excuse they're using." Savannah felt rage bubbling up inside her, not for herself, but for him. For the man who had spent years building something only to have his own children try to tear it away. "I read what they're saying about you," she said. "That you're mentally unstable. That you've been making erratic decisions. That you're not competent to manage your own affairs. It's all lies. Carefully constructed lies designed to paint a picture of decline. I know. Anyone who's spent 5 minutes with you knows that." She took his hand, feeling his fingers tremble slightly in hers. "Daniel, I came here to tell you something." "What?" "I'm not going to let them destroy you." She didn't know where the words came from, but they felt true. "I don't care about your money, Daniel. I never did. But I care about you. And I'm not going to stand by while they tear you apart." Daniel stared at her, and something in his expression cracked open. "Why? After everything I did, the lies, the deception, why would you care what happens to me?" "Because you sat in my diner for 5 weeks and listened to me like I mattered," she said simply. "Because you looked at me like I was special, not because of what I could give you, but because of who I am. Because you made me feel like my dreams weren't stupid and my life wasn't small." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the stubble that was starting to gray at the edges. "And because somewhere between the cornbread and the 3rd cup of coffee, I fell in love with you too, you ridiculous man." For a long moment, Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at her with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. Then very slowly, he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "Probably not," she agreed, her voice muffled against his chest. "But you've got me anyway." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other, letting the weight of the past 2 weeks finally lift. The city sparkled beyond the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding in this glass tower. But inside this room, everything had changed. When they finally pulled apart, Savannah wiped her eyes and looked at him with the practical determination that had gotten her through every hardship in her life. "Now," she said, "tell me about this lawsuit, and then we're going to figure out how to fight it." Daniel led her to a sitting area where documents were spread across a coffee table. For the next 2 hours, he walked her through the legal situation, the claims his children were making, the evidence they were manufacturing, the board members they had turned against him, the timeline they were working with. It was worse than Savannah had imagined. Madison and Tyler weren't just trying to take control of the company. They were trying to have Daniel declared legally incompetent, which would strip him of all rights to manage his own affairs. If they succeeded, they would become his guardians, controlling everything from his finances to his medical decisions. "They could lock me away," Daniel said quietly. "Put me in some luxury facility where I'd be comfortable but powerless, and then they'd strip the company for parts, sell off everything I built, and live off the proceeds until there was nothing left. That's not going to happen. Savannah, no. She gripped his hand tighter. Listen to me. I spent my whole life watching people get pushed around by others with more power. My grandmother worked herself to death serving people who didn't deserve her kindness. Marcus walked all over me because I let him. I am done watching good people get destroyed by bad ones. What do you suggest? We fight. We get the best lawyers money can buy. We counter every lie with the truth. We show the world who you really are, not who they're trying to make you look like. They'll come after you. They'll drag your name through the mud. Every detail of your life will be fodder for tabloids and court filings. Let them come. Savannah's voice was steel. I've got nothing to hide. I'm a waitress who gave a stranger soup and refused his money. If that's the worst they can find, they're going to be disappointed. Daniel looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. You really aren't afraid of them. I'm terrified. But I'm more afraid of what happens if I don't stand up. And what if we lose? What if, despite everything, they take it all away? Savannah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Then we'll figure out what comes next. Together. Because Daniel, the thing I learned from my grandmother, the thing she taught me without ever saying it out loud, is that the measure of a person isn't what they have. It's who they are when they have nothing. She squeezed his hand. You came to my diner with nothing. No name, no status, no power. And I liked who you were then. If we end up with nothing again, I'll still like who you are. Daniel's eyes overflowed. He pulled her close again, pressing his face into her hair, his shoulders shaking with emotion. How did I find you? He whispered. In all the world, how did I find you? You were looking for kindness, she said softly. And I was in the only place I knew how to be. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe we find what we need when we finally start looking for the right things. They stayed like that until the sun set and the city lights replaced the daylight. Then Savannah made coffee in Daniel's ridiculously expensive kitchen, and they stayed up until midnight planning their next moves. By the time she finally left, they had the beginning of a strategy. By the time she returned the next day, they had hope. The legal battle that followed was ugly. Madison and Tyler Warren had money, lawyers, and a willingness to destroy anyone who got in their way. They leaked stories to the press painting Savannah as everything from a con artist to a homewrecker. They brought in experts to testify that Daniel's judgment was impaired. They tried to freeze his assets and take control of his companies. But they underestimated two things. First, they underestimated Daniel. For all his soul-searching and identity crises, he was still a man who had built a $3 billion empire from nothing. When pushed, he pushed back with the full force of his legal team, his business acumen, and his refusal to let his children erase him. Second, they underestimated Savannah. She didn't hide from the press. She didn't crumble under the accusations. Instead, she stood beside Daniel at every press conference, every court appearance, every public event, looking reporters in the eye and telling the truth. She was a waitress who had given a stranger soup on a rainy night. She had never known Daniel was wealthy. She had never asked him for a dime. And she was in love with the man, not the money. Her testimony was devastating to the Warrens' case. Witnesses from May's kitchen corroborated her story. May herself took the stand and described Savannah as the most generous, honest person she had ever known. Old Mr. Patterson talked about watching Savannah give away her tips to customers who needed them more. The young couple who had been sharing a milkshake that first night remembered her refusal to take Daniel's $5. The judge was not impressed by Madison and Tyler Warren's claims of mental incompetence. Daniel was sharp, articulate, and clearly in command of his faculties. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and the judge publicly reprimanded the Warren children for wasting the court's time with what he called a transparent attempt to seize an inheritance they had not earned. It was over, but the victory tasted bittersweet. That night, Savannah and Daniel sat together in the penthouse. watching the lights of Nashville sparkle against the dark river. They were exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but also, for the first time, truly at peace. "What happens now?" Savannah asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about that, about what I want the rest of my life to look like. And I don't want to run hotels anymore. I've spent 40 years building an empire, and it brought me nothing but money and misery." He turned to look at her. "I want to do something that matters, something that helps people who are struggling the way you were struggling when I walked into that diner." "What are you thinking?" "A foundation, maybe several, focused on education, on housing, on giving people the tools they need to build better lives." He smiled. "I could use a partner, someone who understands what it's like to work hard and still barely make ends meet, someone who knows how to listen to people and make them feel seen." Savannah raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership, in everything." He took her hand. "I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other for a few months. But Savannah, I've spent my whole life being patient and careful and strategic, and it got me 2 terrible children and a divorce. I don't want to be patient anymore. I want to build something with you. Something real." "Daniel, you don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer ever, if that's not what you want. But I need you to know that I'm all in. Whatever that looks like. At whatever pace you're comfortable with, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Savannah looked at him, this man who had wandered into her diner disguised as a homeless stranger and somehow turned her entire life upside down. She thought about everything she had been through to get to this moment. The years of struggle, the broken engagement, her grandmother's death, the endless nights of wondering if things would ever get better. And then she thought about the future. A future where she didn't have to count every dollar. A future where she could write, really write, the stories she had always dreamed of telling. A future with a man who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I have one condition," she said. "Anything. We keep going to May's kitchen, at least once a week, and you order the soup and cornbread, and I sit across from you and we talk like we did in the beginning." Daniel's smile was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I think I can manage that." "Then yes, to all of it, the foundation, the partnership, the everything." She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and certain. "Yes." Daniel kissed her back, and in that kiss was everything they had built together. The trust, the pain, the hope, and the love. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "You know," Savannah said, resting her forehead against his, "when you walked into that diner, I thought you were just another sad story looking for somewhere warm to sit. What do you think now?" "I think you were the beginning of my story, the one I've been waiting my whole life to tell." Daniel pulled her close. "Then let's make it a good one." Over the following months, their life together took shape. Savannah moved out of her small apartment and into Daniel's penthouse, but she insisted on keeping things practical. She brought her grandmother's quilt and her battered coffee maker, and the jar of emergency money she no longer needed, but couldn't bring herself to throw away. The penthouse, once a monument to cold luxury, slowly filled with warmth and history, and the accumulated evidence of a shared life. She kept working at May's kitchen for another 3 months, partly because she had promised May she would stay until they found her replacement, and partly because she wasn't ready to let go of who she had been before everything changed. The regulars accepted Daniel as one of their own, once they got over the shock of learning who he really was. Old Mr. Patterson took to calling him the Soup Man and asking pointed questions about his investment portfolio. May herself threatened to throw him out if he ever tried to buy the diner, then hugged him and told him he was lucky to have found someone like Savannah. "Don't screw it up," she warned him. That girl is 1 in a million. I know, Daniel said. Believe me, I know. In the spring, Savannah enrolled in a writing program at Vanderbilt. It was strange being a student again at 35, surrounded by 20-somethings who had never worked a double shift or wondered how they would pay rent. But her professors recognized something in her writing, a maturity and depth that came from having lived the kind of stories most people only imagined. Daniel attended every reading she gave, sitting in the back of the room with a proud smile that made her blush. Afterward, he would take her to dinner and ask her to read him the parts she hadn't shared publicly, the ones that were too raw, too personal, too true. He listened to every word like it was a gift, which is exactly what it was. Their first real fight came 6 months into their relationship. It was a stupid argument about money, specifically about Daniel's desire to buy her a car. Savannah didn't want his money. She wanted to earn her own way. Daniel couldn't understand why she was being so stubborn about something so insignificant to him. "It's not insignificant to me," Savannah had said, her voice rising. "You can't just buy your way through every problem. That's not how relationships work. I'm not trying to buy my way through anything. I'm trying to make your life easier. My life doesn't need to be easier. It needs to be mine." They had gone to bed angry that night, sleeping on opposite sides of the mattress with a cold space between them. But in the morning, Daniel had made coffee and brought it to her, and they had talked for hours about what they each needed, what they each feared, what it meant to build a partnership between equals when one person had billions and the other had a used Honda Civic. They came out of that fight stronger. They learned to argue without destroying each other. They learned that love wasn't the absence of conflict, but the commitment to work through it. By summer, they had found their rhythm. Daniel stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company, bringing in new leadership he trusted to carry forward his vision. Savannah finished her first semester of classes with honors and started work on her novel in earnest. Together, they began building the foundation, meeting with community organizers and education experts and housing advocates, learning what people actually needed rather than what wealthy donors assumed they needed. And through it all, every Sunday without fail, they went to May's kitchen. They sat in their booth, the one farthest from the door, and ordered soup and cornbread and coffee. They talked about nothing and everything, about fears and hopes and the small mundane details of their shared existence. It was their ritual, their anchor, their way of remembering where they had begun. A year later, Savannah Cole stood at the window of the apartment she shared with Daniel, looking out at a Nashville morning gold with autumn light. So much had changed since that rainy night in May's kitchen that sometimes she barely recognized her own life. The foundation was thriving. The Callaway Cole Foundation, named for her grandmother and Daniel's mother, had already helped thousands of families find housing, education, and hope. Savannah had hired May's daughter to run the hospitality division, giving young people from struggling backgrounds the chance to learn skills that would serve them for life. And she was writing. Not just writing, but finishing. Her first novel, a story about a grandmother who sacrificed everything for her granddaughter's dreams, would be published in the spring. The dedication read, "For Daniel, who saw me before he knew who I was." Daniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," she said. "Nothing. How strange life is." "Good strange or bad strange?" "Good. Definitely good." She turned in his arms to face him. "A year ago, I was a waitress counting every penny. Now I'm this. A philanthropist? A partner. A writer. A woman in love with a ridiculous man who tested her with a $5 bill." Daniel laughed. "In my defense, you didn't take the $5. In my defense, you didn't tell me you were a billionaire." "Fair point." He kissed her forehead. "For what it's worth, I don't regret any of it. The test, the disguise, the lies. Not because they were right, but because they led me to you. You could have just walked in as yourself, you know, asked me out like a normal person. And you would have said yes? Savannah considered. Probably not, actually. I would have thought you were some rich guy looking for a fling with the waitress. I would have been suspicious of every word out of your mouth. Exactly. Sometimes the unconventional path is the only path. That sounds like something you'd put on a motivational poster. Maybe I will. The unconventional path is the only path. Signed, the billionaire who pretended to be homeless to find love. Savannah laughed, and Daniel joined her, and for a moment, the penthouse was filled with the kind of joy that money couldn't buy and poverty couldn't steal. Later that day, they went to May's kitchen. It was a Sunday tradition now, honored every week without fail. They sat in their booth, the same corner booth where everything had started, and ordered soup and cornbread and coffee. May herself came over to serve them, her round face beaming. "My two favorite customers," she said. "You know, ever since that newspaper did the story about how you met here, business has been through the roof. People coming from all over the country hoping to find their own billionaire in disguise." "Have any of them?" Daniel asked. "Not yet, but hope keeps them coming back." May winked. "And the soup doesn't hurt." When she was gone, Savannah reached across the table and took Daniel's hand. His fingers wrapped around hers, familiar and warm. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me. That first night, when I was just a tired waitress at the end of a long shift. You saw me as a person, not as a servant or a charity case or a means to an end. Just a person, deserving of dignity. You were easy to see," Daniel said. "You shone." "I didn't feel like I was shining. I felt like I was surviving." Sometimes surviving is the bravest kind of shining there is. Savannah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were the good kind. The kind that came from being understood by someone who loved you. "I have something for you," Daniel said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Savannah's heart stopped. "Daniel, I know we talked about not needing a piece of paper to validate what we have, and I meant that. But I also know that you spent your whole life feeling like you weren't enough, like you didn't deserve good things." He opened the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring, a single diamond set in a band of rose gold. "I want you to wear this as a reminder, not of what I'm giving you, but of what you've always deserved. Love that sees you. Love that chooses you. Love that stays." Savannah couldn't speak. She could barely breathe. "It doesn't have to mean anything official if you don't want it to," Daniel continued. "We can call it a promise ring or a friendship ring or a we've been through hell together and came out the other side ring. I just want you to have something tangible, something you can look at when things are hard and remember that you are worthy of every good thing in this world." The tears spilled over. Savannah laughed and cried at the same time, overwhelmed by feelings she couldn't contain. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the ring. Yes to everything." She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "But Daniel, I want the official version too. I want the piece of paper. I want to stand in front of people we love and promise to keep choosing each other." Daniel's smile could have lit up the entire city. "Then that's what we'll do. But one more condition. Anything. We get married here, at May's kitchen, in the booth where it all started." Daniel laughed out loud. "May would have a heart attack. May would be thrilled. You're right, she would." He leaned across the table and kissed her, soft and sweet, tasting of coffee and cornbread. May's kitchen it is. The wedding happened on a crisp December day, exactly 2 years after a man in shabby clothes had walked into a diner and had his life changed by a woman who refused his $5. The booth was decorated with white flowers. May catered the whole thing, insisting that her soup and cornbread be the main course. Mr. Patterson was Daniel's best man. Denise was Savannah's matron of honor. It wasn't a billionaire's wedding. There were no crystal chandeliers or ice sculptures or $500 a plate dinners. There was just love, witnessed by the people who mattered, in the place where everything had begun. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, half the room tensed, wondering if Madison or Tyler would burst through the doors. But the doors stayed closed. Daniel's children had retreated from his life entirely, choosing their bitterness over any chance of reconciliation. It was their loss, and Daniel had made his peace with it. Savannah wore a simple cream dress she had found at a vintage shop downtown. Daniel wore a suit, but he had tucked a $5 bill into his pocket, a reminder of the bet he had made and the jackpot he had found. When they exchanged vows, Savannah spoke first. "I promise to see you," she said. "Not your money, not your name, not what the world says you are. Just you, the man who orders soup he doesn't need and leaves tips he can afford to lose. The man who listened to my stories when no one else cared. The man who taught me that I deserve good things, not because I earned them, but because I am worthy of love just as I am." Daniel's eyes glistened. "I promise to choose you," he said. "Every day, in every way, I will choose you. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. You are the kindness I searched for. You are the hope I almost gave up on. You are the proof that the world is not as cold as I feared. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the grace you've shown me." They kissed, and the small crowd cheered, and somewhere in the back of the diner, May was crying into her apron and muttering about how her mascara was ruined, but she didn't care. After the ceremony, Savannah and Daniel sat in their booth one more time. The celebrations swirled around them, but for a moment, they existed in their own bubble, just the two of them and the memories this place held. "Can you believe we're here?" Savannah asked. "No," Daniel admitted. "And yes," both at the same time. "What happens next?" "Everything. Nothing. Whatever we want." He took her hand, running his thumb over the ring on her finger. "I learned something from you, Savannah. Something that all my money and power never taught me." "What's that?" "That the best things in life can't be bought. They can only be given." He smiled. "You gave me yourself when I had nothing to offer. You gave me kindness when I was a stranger. You gave me hope when I had given up." He lifted her hand and kissed it. "I spent my whole life accumulating, and you taught me that the only thing worth having is the one thing you can't put a price on. Love? Love." He pulled her close. "And now I get to spend the rest of my life giving it back to you." Outside the window, snow began to fall over Nashville, soft and white and quiet. Inside May's kitchen, Savannah Cole and Daniel Warren held each other and watched the world turn beautiful. They would face challenges in the years ahead. No life is without them. But they would face them together, partners in everything, bound not by money or obligation, but by the simplest and most powerful force in the universe. Love, freely given and gratefully received, the kind that changes everything